Good evening, everybody. I'm David Suddjian. Welcome to Bird Bombs, helpful bursts of ID info. And tonight we have episode 18, I'm molting. Tonight we're talking about molt, and this is actually a really foundational topic. In fact, here's a quote from a great and very important guide that was just published in a second edition, the Identification Guide to North American Birds by Peter Pyle. And he says at the beginning of his discussion on molt, he says, a complete understanding of the timing, sequence, and extent of molts is an essential aspect of the accurate aging and sexing of birds in the hand. All right, but we're not talking about birds in the hand, most of us. We're not really dealing with that. So we're going to modify that a little bit, bird bomb style here. We're going to say a basic understanding of the nuts and bolts of molt is key to developing field ID skills. All right, so this is one of those foundational things that a lot of times, until you become a good birder, you don't realize how foundational an understanding of molt is, because it really comes into play all the time with what you're seeing, and especially as you get interested in looking for unusual things and so forth. The understanding of molt is very important. It helps you to identify many different species, and also besides just identifying the bird, you can observe details about the age and the sex of the bird and the status of its molt. All these things you can appreciate a lot more. So molting really helps you to see more clearly. It's kind of like coming to the understanding of the parts of the birds and the names of things and different feather tracks at some good basic level. Helps you to understand and see more clearly when you're looking at birds. And it's the same thing with molt. So here's a couple, three actually really important resources, and I want to focus on these books for just a moment. The Identification Guide to North American Birds by Peter Pyle is an amazing book, and a lot of what I'm talking about tonight is presented very well in those volumes, which he just published in the second edition. But they're really intense, kind of expensive too. Big books and really intense, and they're geared towards dealing with birds in the hand and a lot of details. But if you're a really serious birder, and you like books, it's a great resource, and I recommend it. Another one that's less intensive than that, in the Peterson Reference Series by Steve Howell, the Peterson Reference Guide to Molt in North American Birds. And Pyle and Howell are both ornithologists who are modern ornithologists who are very significant players in our understanding and study of molt in our birds. So two very important players there that are infusing a lot of our program tonight. You also have at your fingertips for free the Birds of the World that you can access through eBird or through Cornell. And there you can go to species accounts and you can find information about molt. But the thing is, when you start to look at that, you're soon going to find that there's a lot of terms that you may not know, and it's kind of heavy wading through the paragraphs about that. And so it may not yield a lot of fruit. So tonight we're going to take you to a place where you can understand enough that you can interpret these different resources that we have. And when you're in the field, you're going to be able to apply this directly. So a bird's feathers get worn, right? This is their basic garment, and it's providing a lot of different functions for them, but they wear out over the course of the weeks and the months and over the course of the year, and they have to be replaced. So the replacement of some or all of the feathers is called a molt. I'm not talking about a single tail feather that falls out that the bird might regrow very soon after, but plumages are renewed by molt in a predictable manner and on an annual basis. So molts can either be complete, they can include all the feathers being replaced in the same molt period, or they can be incomplete where only some of the feathers are replaced, for example, just body feathers. And so also, in addition to providing the new feathers that are fresh and strong and going to provide their function well, molts can also give a bird a new look. So new colors or patterns reveal the age and sex of the bird, and we're familiar with that with a lot of our beautiful songbirds that we see in the nesting season. So molt isn't something that just happens in a snap and there you are. In a lot of cases, molts can be suspended during the course of things. They can pause at different phases of breeding or migration and for different reasons, and they can be protracted over quite a number of months, particularly in larger birds. So here's the basic core of what you need to understand about molts in birds is that there's a cycle. Okay, it's called the annual molt cycle. All birds have a regular molt that's called the pre-basic molt, and that defines the annual molt cycle. So essentially, the annual molt cycle begins with the first shedding, the shedding of the first primary, all the way to when that first primary is shed again. That's the annual molt cycle, but it's defined by this pre-basic molt, and we're going to be getting into what that is all about. The annual molt it's a complete molt, or nearly so. In most species, it's complete, that replaces all the feathers, and it usually is following the nesting season. Okay, so this is the pre-basic molt. Large birds may require, a longer period of time to replace all of their flight feathers than just 1 year. But for most birds, they have a regular molt named the pre-basic molt, and it kind of forms the core of the whole program here. So you can think of it like a basic plan. And the basic plan is you molt only once annually. Once you've got past your beginning stages in life, in your adult form, adult appearance, you're only molting one time. That's the basic plan. But then we're going to complicate it, and we're going to see that there's an alternate plan. And so this is where you want to add a little color. So you have that complete molt after nesting, and then a partial molt at another time in the year that's going to happen before nesting, that's going to serve its particular purpose. There's also a rare third way, a complete molt twice each year. So the basic plan has just that one molt annually, and those are the species we see that basically look the same. Basically, I say, pun not intended, they look the same all year round, like the horned lark. Once it's in its adult appearance, it looks the same all year round. So that's the basic plan. And then we can think about the alternate plan where we have a molt into, often we see it as a bright breeding plumage, like with the Western tanager, that becomes brighter before its breeding season. And a rare third way, a good example of this in our bird realm is the bobolink, which has a complete molt after the nesting season, and another complete molt before the nesting season. So that's relatively rare in the bird world. So every bird has a basic plumage, right? So we have the pre-basic molt results in a basic plumage. So it sounds kind of mysterious when you hear this pre that molt and pre this molt, but it just means that that molt is going to result in the plumage with that name. So the pre-basic molt acquired once a year is a complete or near complete molt that results in basic plumage. Now, it's not the only plumage that birds have, of course. Some birds, all birds have a juvenile plumage, and some have what we'll learn is a formative plumage, and some have an alternate plumage, like we were talking about with that brighter springtime breeding season coloration. And some of these plumages result from what are called inserted molts. Now, this sounds kind of technical to start with, but let's go back to our basic cycle. The annual molt cycle is defined by that pre-basic molt. So after the nesting season, birds molt, and they go through a 1 year loop there, and that's that annual cycle. But in the course of evolution, some other molts have been inserted into that. One is a molt that is happening only in the first year of life, called preformative molt. We'll learn more about that. The other is that one that's happening before the nesting season, the pre-alternate molt. So we call those inserted molts. That's because they're added into that annual molt cycle through the process of evolution. So a molt results in a plumage, right? The basic point. And now we've got 4 of our key molts and key plumages listed here, and we're going to use the Yellow-rumped Warbler to help us tour through this little progression, the sequence involving here. Remember, the ensuing plumage is defined by the molt. So a pre-juvenile molt results in a juvenile plumage. So this is the plumage that the bird develops from its downy plumage while it's in the nest, and then it fledges in this plumage, in the case of the Yellow-rumped Warbler, and looks a little different. And then it's going to molt very soon after in its preformative molt, and that will result in a formative plumage. And we can think of the formative plumage as kind of like a teenager plumage. Okay, that's what I'm going to go with for right now. So it's in transition in the youth of the bird. The next molt that we have there is the pre-basic molt. Now, we just learned about that. That's the one that changes out all the feathers after the nesting season and results in a basic plumage. That's the one that forms the core of the annual molt cycle, the pre-basic molt. And the last one there, the pre-alternate molt, results in an alternate plumage. So using our yellow-rumped warbler, we can see when we have warblers coming back to us in September and October, they're going to look like the one shown there above basic plumage. And when they're here now, if you go up in the mountains, you can see the males still looking like this, this gorgeous one here in the lower right corner. So we call those, the plumages go by the name of the molt that comes before them, even though the molt might not replace all the feathers. In a lot of cases, the molts do not replace all the feathers. Preformative molts do not replace all the feathers. Pre-basic molts usually do, pre-alternate molts do not. So a bird may be wearing more than one generation of feathers at a time. So here's the basic plan. We're going to spotlight the American robin to help us kind of walk through these different sequences. Got some technical details above there in the center, and worth noting is that there is no pre-alternate molt in the American robin. So it's one of those that's the basic plan. It looks the same all year round once it's reached its adult appearance. Of course, it begins with an egg in the nest, and coming from that are downy little chicks. They begin kind of naked, and they soon grow downy feathers in their natal down, their first little coating. And very soon after they're born, they're going to grow that down, but they're going to begin their very first molt. They're going to replace the down with a juvenile plumage. So this is a molt. This pre-juvenile molt occurs in the nest for a robin, and the bird is going to fledge from the nest in that juvenile plumage. As they get a little bigger, they start to reveal what that juvenile plumage looks like. And we can recognize some features on these baby robins in the nest that we're familiar when we see them out now, like the spots on the breast and some other things as well. So when they fledge, they're fledging in this juvenile plumage, and characteristics of juvenile birds is that they tend to look soft. They often look distinctively different from the adults. When they're really new, they have a nice pale gape. That's this pale area at the base of the bill you see on this robin. In the case of the robin, it's spotted underneath and it's spotted on its back. And look, this one's a brand new little baby, and its tail's not growing out yet, and it looks like it's still got some growing to do. And sometimes you see them that way. More commonly, you see them when they're fully ready to go, like this juvenile plumage robin, which we see a lot of this time of year. Notice the face pattern looks a little different, but the bird has a lot of similarities to an adult, but definitely some strong differences in the plumage. And as it's going along, it's going to begin to embark on another molt, its second molt, just in the first 2 months of its life, really. So it's going to leave behind the juvenile plumage, and it's going to enter into a pre-formative molt that's going to create a formative plumage. And this is going to be the plumage it's going to wear during the first year of its life. And initially it looks transitional, like you see this bird's losing some of those spots and developing more of the orange underneath, more like an adult as it comes into its formative plumage. Here's a robin in formative plumage. It looks kind of pale. A lot of times the formative plumage looks like the adult plumage, but a little different, sometimes quite like, but in this case, a little different. The robins, formative plumage robins are paler above and below as well. And so this is what they're going to wear for their whole first year of life after they've molted out of that juvenile plumage. But when they come back around to summertime and they're now 1 year old, or maybe 1 year and a couple months or so, actually, they're going to molt again. And this will be a pre-basic molt. They're going to molt all their feathers, and it's called the second pre-basic molt. And it's going to take them into their definitive basic plumage, where they have the appearance of an adult. So the definitive part means it's like the final plumage. Basic, of course, is our core plumage. The robin only has the one, and definitive means it looks like the end result. So it's got to the end point. And so that's going to be its plumage it's going to wear for its second year. And then it's going to have that same molt again in the next summer, and so on and so on. So here's our pre-basic molt happening. The robin starts to look kind of scruffy and not so good. And he still looks, obviously feathers are growing here, and things are changing. And we're then looking a little more fine and dandy. Notice the nice pale margins on the underpart feathers is a good sign of a nice fresh plumage on this robin. Here we don't see so much of those pale margins on this bird a little later in the year. Nice full-on definitive basic plumage. That was the male. Here's the female. And then it comes around full cycle, and there they are on the nest again, and soon it's eggs in the nest. But wait. You may be saying, hold on now. We went from pre-juvenile, juvenile plumage, and then we went to second pre-basic molt. What happened to the first pre-basic molt? What's going on? Well, it turns out that the first pre-basic molt, and this is mostly just a matter of names, is actually the pre-juvenile molt is the first pre-basic molt. Okay, this is an important point to kind of grasp, but we call that very first one by a different name to distinguish its unique quality in that position in the bird's life, and the unique nature of that feather set. So the first pre-basic molt is the pre-juvenile molt. So when you go down here and it says second pre-basic molt, that's what happened to the first pre-basic molt. So we'll stay with that a little bit. All right, so now it was all straightforward and you got it all down. So now we're going to, no pun intended, you got it all down, but we're going to complicate things a little bit. Actually, we're not, because I've already introduced the idea of the alternate plumage and the pre-alternate molt that leads to it. Let's use the chipping sparrow to help us tour through this time. We have the eggs in the nest, then we have the downy little chicks, and they're going to develop a juvenile plumage in that nest. So they're going to have a pre-juvenile molt and molt to their juvenile plumage. And then the next molt up after they've left the nest, it's going to begin in the fall, and it's going to end for them wherever they're wintering is a preformative molt. And they're going to move from the streaked underparts to less streaked, and all of a sudden look a little bit more like an adult. So here's the adult we're familiar with down below, and notice the appearance is getting a little closer with that preformative molt into formative plumage. But then as we're getting into spring, we're going to insert another molt. The pre-alternate molt will be inserted there before the nesting time, right before it. And the birds then will begin to look different. They're going to develop their red crown and the white supercilium and the black eye line, and no more streaks underneath, nice and gray, no buffy tones down there. So they're in their alternate plumage. Okay, and then after that, they're gonna nest in that alternate plumage, and then after that, they're going to molt back into a basic plumage with the pre-basic molt. So we're inserting on the robin, which had that basic plan, we're going to insert the alternate plan here with the chipping sparrow. Remember, we have two different kinds of plumages inserted into that annual molt cycle that's defined by the pre-basic molt. We have the formative plumage that the bird wears only once after leaving the nest, after its first molt after juvenile plumage, and then this alternate plumage that it will molt repeatedly over the years of its life. So maybe this will help you with this pattern. So let's see if we can put this together now using these familiar themes. All right, so we all begin in our natal down, our birthday suit, our diapers, whatever it is, and then we have our next plumage after that down is our juvenile plumage. And we bolt into that when we're still really little, and then we wear that out of the nest, but it's not so strong as we're going to need. And so our next plumage is a formative plumage. And you can think of this as coming of age. It's getting a little stronger. So the feathers need to be stronger than the juvenile feathers. And so the bird molts into this formative plumage. And notice it looks more like the adult. In this case, we have a male, so I'll just say it looks more like the adult male, both in its general appearance, right? So after that formative plumage, it's going to wear that through the course of, in the case of a bird, through 1 year, but for a person longer, right? And eventually, we're going to have a first alternate plumage. That pre-alternate molt is going to take into a first alternate plumage, where the bird really is looking, in the case of this, a lot more sharp, looking dope. And looks a lot like the adult, but not quite the same. Sometimes that's the case where the first alternate plumage, maybe think about like a red start, isn't quite like the full-on definitive adult plumage. So after that first alternate plumage, we have our definitive basic plumage. And that's kind of our basic garb that we wear most of the time, maybe all year round for some of us. But others of us want to spiffy up at times and look sharp. And so we have a definitive alternate plumage. So you can kind of make a little analogy here. Bear with me. Let's take a little closer look at each of these different molts and plumages to understand them a little better. Now, we've already learned a lot about the basic plumage. Every bird has one. It's acquired once a year with a complete or a near complete pre-basic molt. So the very first one of those, point number 2, begins in the nest. Remember, that's that pre-juvenile molt, which is actually the first pre-basic molt. And after that, every year, there's a single complete or near complete annual replacement of feathers with the pre-basic molt. So in most birds in our realm of the world, the molt happens soon after the breeding season. In fact, while the birds are still concluding their nesting cycle, they may already be beginning their pre-basic molt, and that's going to result in a basic plumage that's going to come in after they're done nesting. I will note that the timing of these things, it varies from different types of birds and all of that. So we're speaking kind of generally here and kind of fitting it into one box and thinking especially about passerines with some of these details, but it applies to everything because every bird has these molts. So it turns out these molts are ancestral in all bird lineages, having evolved from similar processes in reptiles. So that understanding is kind of important for understanding how these molts actually kind of all fit together and how they can relate to each other, even though they seem among different species to be kind of at odds with each other at times. So nonetheless, so for a lot of the birds we see, we only see them in basic plumage. Like a great blue heron, once it's in its adult appearance, we only see it that way. And maybe some plumes develop a little bit, but those are not actually resulting from a pre-alternate molt, but it is the basic plumage, and the plumes are actually growing out in that way at that time. So a lot of birds, that's all we see is a basic plumage. Robin, for example, from earlier. So a lot of birds undergo this molt, as I said, in the late summer to early fall when the feathers are worn and most in need of replacement. So they're about a year old and they wear out. And nesting season in particular places a lot of demands. So here we are on this white-crowned sparrow theme, and here we've got our beautiful mountain white-crowned sparrow that just popped up in the willow mat singing away up at Kite Lake. This was mid-July, and you'll notice this bird's looking pretty dapper. This is a bird singing on breeding territory, so we know it's in alternate plumage. And we can compare, though, with the other birds on either side, which just happen to be a different subspecies, but forget about that. Just look at the bird in the middle, and its underparts are a little bit ruffled, right? Look at the birds on either side, nice and smooth. So those birds have fresh plumage. Our bird is in the tail end of the cycle, and it may have already begun its pre-basic molt. And soon it's going to start to look a lot more like something's going on. And when you see a bird that's looking splotchy like this, often they're preening. They're removing feathers, stuff's coming in, they got to preen. And soon, their tail is gone and new tail feathers are coming in, new primaries are growing, different things. And so you don't see white-crowned sparrows like this very often, I'll bet you. And then a little scruffy looking. And sometimes, it's just really something else to see these birds. And you have to sometimes say, what is that thing? What is that thing? The scruffy equals a molting adult. So when you see a scruffy bird at this time of year, it's not a juvenile bird. The juveniles are pretty neat and tidy, but the adults are undergoing this molt of their feathers, and they can have all these gaps. The juveniles, even if they're molting their formative plumage, it's not as a complete extreme molt as in these adults. And so they don't end up looking splotchy for the most part. So when you see that, that's a good sign that you're dealing with an adult. But the question is, just like with this white-crowned sparrow that doesn't have his tail, and you don't see them like that very often, they're heading towards this, but in order to get there, they have to go through this molt. But where do they go? I mean, we don't see birds that look funky like that so often for a lot of species. At the beginning of the show, I had a blue jay on there that was bald-headed, and maybe you've rarely ever seen that, but they do that every year. Coming up, just in the coming weeks, every one of our adult blue jays is going to go bald, but maybe you won't even see one. Where do they go? Well, it turns out that passerines and some other birds too But passerines, especially when they molt, they become less evident to us. They become more quiet, they hide away, they don't move around as much, they don't make themselves as visible in flight, may not even be able to fly as efficiently. They do a lot of preening and skulking around and just kind of resting. So in fact, you can see that in your own backyard through your own observations. And this is showing us a graph. I had to throw in a graph here. So this is song sparrow, frequency of song sparrow in Jefferson County. And look at this big dip. So we can see that the song sparrow is pretty numerous much of the year, and it has a peak in the spring that's associated with birds moving on to singing on their territory, establishing their territory, and a lot more song going on. And then it trails off, and there's very relatively small detections of song sparrows during the period of the middle of August. That's the time that they're molting, and they're hiding away, and you just don't see them. They're not going anywhere really. They're all still around in our area, but they're molting. And in the coming weeks, as we get into October, boop, 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 song sparrows start to reappear where you're having a hard time finding them before. Isn't that awesome? So this is a process that takes time. It doesn't just happen for a lot of birds in just a little bit of time. For the song sparrow, it may be a period of several weeks, and it's happening close to where their breeding territory, maybe not on it, but close to it, maybe in it. But for some other birds, like these Baird sandpipers, the molt may be paused during migration. These are adult Bairds that have begun to molt into a basic plumage, and they're kind of worn looking. This is in July, and they're going to pause their molt as they move through their migration, and may continue to molt on stopover grounds or at wintering grounds. That's one strategy. In some cases, like those that migrate very far away, that pre-basic molt can be projected for a long time once they get down to where they're going. And some species undergo an interesting thing called a molt migration, and our chipping sparrows are known for that. Although the evidence of it is not always easy to observe, but birds moving from the mountains to migrate out into prairie areas and maybe other areas in the Southwest where foraging conditions are better, that support their molting process to a better degree than if they were to remain where they were. So molt migration is a molt migration just for the purpose of undergoing molt somewhere else that might have better conditions. And so when birds have got to that second year and they're in that second fall, they've completed that second pre-basic molt, they're about a year and 3 months old, or maybe something like that. Many passerines and many non-passerine land birds, they have their mature appearance at that time. Now we know in the case of some water birds and other large birds that it may take multiple years. So pre-basic molt, basic plumage, the core of the whole thing, but happening one time at the beginning of the bird's life is the pre-juvenile molt. The first coat of pennaceous feathers is the juvenile plumage acquired by the pre-juvenile molt, which we remember is the same as the first pre-basic molt. So as these little chicks in the nest are growing out those wing feathers, often the flight feathers are some of the first ones to start to develop on these little chicks in the nest. As those are growing out, and downy plumage will be replaced by other more normal looking feathers, pennaceous feathers, that is that first pre-basic molt, but we call it the pre-juvenile molt. So juvenile birds often look different from the adults. As we see in the case of this white-crowned sparrow using, for example, it's all streaked underneath. It looks fresh, a little disheveled because it's kind of soft looking. It's pretty fresh. The one down on the lower right is a little older. His streaks have now, he's beginning maybe to molt his preformative molt. So some of those streaks are disappearing on us. So the preformative molt follows that pre-juvenile molt and juvenile plumage. And those juvenile feathers, they have to grow very quickly. When the bird's in the nest, it has to develop that very first, that juvenile plumage very quickly. And so the feathers aren't as strong as they could be. And so they're weaker than feathers that are going to come after them in the bird's life. Plus, these young birds put themselves in situations where they can create more feather wear than might happen for more experienced birds. So we have this extra inserted molt that is unique to the first molt cycle of the bird's life, and that's this preformative molt. And it comes out with the formative plumage. And we can see here in our white-crowned sparrow that this is what we commonly call an immature. All right, so the formative plumage is often what we term an immature plumage. And its main purpose is to provide a stronger feather than the juvenile plumage. So the bird's going to remain in this plumage all the way until its second summer of its life. So the feathers need to be a little stronger. So that's the principal purpose. And so for most species, a preformative molt is happening near their breeding grounds within the first few months after fledging. And it often looks a lot like an adult plumage. Now, the white-crowned sparrow, they have brown and tan, maybe instead of white and black, but it really looks basically pretty similar. So that's often the case with the formative plumage. So the next one we can consider is the pre-alternate molt, leading to an alternate plumage. So as we said, that in a lot of birds, especially non-passerines, the pre-basic molt is the only molt that occurs during the course of the year. But for some species, shorebirds, some gulls, a lot of songbirds that we love to see so bright and beautiful, they have a second plumage in their annual cycle, that alternate plumage that's acquired through a pre-alternate molt. So this is the plumage that we sometimes call a breeding plumage. This is the plumage for many of the species that they're nesting in. If they acquire a bright color, right? So the robins are nesting in their basic plumage, but for the white-crowned sparrow is an example of one where the basic plumage and the alternate plumage look the same. So I know from the date of these photos that these birds are in alternate plumage because they were taken during the nesting season, but it looks just like we would see, could we see these sparrows during, say, the fall. I will note I've got the mountain Oriantha white-crowned sparrow on all these images except for the lower left is a Gambel's white-crowned sparrow facing the other way there to help us remember he's a little different. Notice the black in the lores of the mountain white-crowned sparrow, the lores being the area between the eye and the bill, and it's pale down there in the Gambel's that we're going to see in just a couple months returning to our area. So the pre-alternate molt, we think of it as making a bird prettier, but really its initial evolutionary function was to replace worn feathers in species that are exposed to harsher environments. So they're getting a little plumage freshen up partway through the year. And in many species, that alternate plumage has also evolved to become brighter than the basic plumage appearance for the purposes of display. All right. And then on the other side of the spectrum, in some ducks and game birds, think ptarmigan, the alternate plumage has evolved to become more cryptic. So the birds are more camouflaged when they're undergoing wing molt later on. And we'll learn about that in just a moment here. So pre-alternate molts are usually limited. Remember, the pre-basic molt was complete, involving all or nearly all of the feathers. Often the pre-alternate molt involves just some of the body feathers and usually not many of the flight feathers and not all of the body feathers. We can see the birds in the top are undergoing that pre-alternate molt. These are birds in April, and you can see they still have the brown of that formative plumage, but they're getting black developing in there and getting white coming in versus that kind of tan that the formative plumaged, quote unquote, immature white-crowned sparrows show. So again, you know, the coloration may be the same as basic plumage, like the white-crowned sparrow, or it can be duller than the basic plumage, like a lot of ducks, or the alternate plumage can be brighter than the basic plumage, like some songbirds. All right, so speaking of the ducks, so in ducks and some game birds, pre-alternate molt has evolved to become more cryptic, and that helps to camouflage individuals as they're undergoing their wing molt. And that wing molt is happening in their pre-basic molt that's following immediately on the heels of and overlapping with the pre-alternate molt. So you've probably heard of eclipse plumage in ducks, like mallards and stuff. And what the heck is up with eclipse plumage? So, you know, when we see a mallard in in the fall and wintertime and most of the spring, all the way into the early part of summer, they look really pretty with their green heads and their white neck ring and their curly tail and their bright or rich chestnut breast and really dapper upper parts and gray flanks. But that is their basic plumage. So the alternate plumage in the case of the mallard is not the bright one. The basic plumage has the brightness to it. And that's because in mallards and other ducks, they do a lot of their courting during the time of the year when they wear that basic plumage. And so that's why it's brighter. But males have a pre-alternate molt at this time of year. Really, we're getting toward the end of it now. And during that time, they trade in that bright plumage for a female-like appearance. And so they lose that green head, they lose that chestnut breast, they lose those gray sides, and they have these brown feathers coming in, this mottled kind of look, and they look a lot like a lady mallard, but there are some differences. Here's some mallards that are pretty much in a full eclipse plumage, which is really just their alternate plumage. So now you know the eclipse plumage is the alternate plumage in these ducks. And it's what they're wearing right now in July and into August. There's a little leeway in the exact timing of things. And in the eclipse plumage, they look like females, but you can see some differences. Notice the bill, notice the dark, which is actually a greenish on top of the head. Notice that the hindquarters don't have a curly tail anymore, but they look a little different than the female hindquarters. There's a female with her black and orange bill versus the male's bill, which is a little drabber than the nesting in the basic plumage. See the one on the upper right has a bright yellow bill, and in the eclipse plumage, alternate plumage, the bill is duller yellow, but it's not orange and it doesn't have the black markings of the female mallard. And she doesn't have any green or dark on her head like he does. And then they're going to start to molt out of that. So right now, they're kind of all in it, or some are still heading into it. And then as we get into late August and especially September and even into October, they're going to be molting out of that. It takes several weeks to do it. They're going to get that green head back. Notice this one in the middle is getting a brighter bill, and he's getting rid of those brown feathers, trading it out with the pre-basic molt for the basic plumage gray sides. He even has a curl coming in on the tail. All right, I love to see that. And getting that nice chestnut coming in on the breast. Love those mallards. So here's another little twist that's fun to look at. So not all changes happen from the course because of the molt. So here we have, I'm going to back up. I didn't even say what this was. And actually, if I don't tell you, it might be a good quiz. I won't take much time with this because these birds look kind of funny if you're not ready for them. But this is a starling. If it was giving its squawking call and with a flock of siblings and parents, you'd know it right away maybe. But the starling in its juvenile plumage looks very different from the adult plumage. And very soon after they fledge, they're going to begin to molt into a preformative molt. And you may know that the starlings, when they're in the fall, we see them with the beautiful white spots all over their black plumage. Well, they got to get there. And so these are birds in molt, and it looks so different. You can appreciate the progress of the molt in these different individuals as they're developing their formative plumage. It's the formative plumage because it's the first one following that juvenile plumage. So these birds are engaged in their preformative molt. And here we have birds in a basic plumage. The preformative plumage looks a lot like the basic plumage. There's some subtle differences. These, I believe, are adults here now we have, and they're very gorgeous in this spotted plumage. But it doesn't look like what they're going to look like when they're breeding. But they do not have another molt. The starling only has the complete pre-basic molt. It does not have a pre-alternate molt. So what's going on is in order to get to the iridescent plumage that is lacking the spots, those feathers with the white spots, the white tips are going to wear off and reveal the iridescent green gloss and some parts purplish gloss below without much spotting. So that's a change that's happening through feather wear. There's actually quite a lot of examples of that in our bird world. We won't take any more tonight, but the starling has no pre-alternate molt, but the white tips of the basic plumage wear away over the course of the winter to reveal iridescent. And when you look at the flocks of starlings, say late winter, you'll see that they're in different progress through that state of wearing away. It's kind of a fun thing to look at. Beautiful birds, as obnoxious as they are. All right, so we're going to quickly wrap up this part here. Just kind of note that all these things fit together in 4 different strategies. Not going to spend much time with this. Looking at the video, you can read it in more detail. 2 of the strategies are rare. The simple basic strategy is one that's employed by things like the golden eagle, where they have only a basic plumage from one year to the next, but then they have a juvenile plumage retained through their first year and some years to get up to that. That's the one strategy. Another rare one is a simple alternate strategy, and the example for that is large gulls, like the Thayer's gull, that remain in their juvenile plumage through their first year of life. Okay, the ones that we see more commonly are the complex basic strategy and the complex alternate strategy. So we can think about the basic strategy as like the robin. They have only a basic plumage. There's a preformative molt into a formative plumage, but there's no pre-alternate molt. And then the complex alternate strategy, of course, has the alternate molt worked in, and we can think of that with shorebirds and our beautiful songbirds like the Yellow-rumped Warbler. But not all, well, anyway. So we're just going to leave that for the sake of time, and we're going to spend a little time on review here now, and we'll lead into a quiz here in just a moment. So let's get back to the basics, and got some fill in the blanks here. They all end with the word molt, and some clues to help you figure out the answer. So the first one, A, this molt is equivalent to the first pre-basic molt. All right, so it says first pre-basic molt, so we know it's early in the life. So what molt would that be? You can think about that. Every bird, B, every bird has this molt every year. So this is a different molt from A. Let's just say, what do we think that first one is? The molt equivalent to first pre-basic molt is the pre-juvenile molt, right? All right, so then every bird has this molt every year. So we learned about one that is at the core of the annual molt cycle. And what is that? You got it, the pre-basic molt. And then C, some birds have this molt, and it may give a different look. So not all birds have it, some do, and in some cases it gives a different look. That's right, the pre-alternate molt. And then the last one, D, many birds have this unique molt, happens only once after fledging. Okay, so this is a word we're less familiar with, but that's that preformative molt. There we go. All right, so here's another set. So what is the molt that defines the annual molt cycle? All right, pre-basic molt. And then we have 2 molts that are inserted into that cycle that weren't, that were evolved, different purposes, and inserted into that annual molt cycle. One happens only once, the other happens annually. Those 2 inserted molts, the preformative molt and the pre-alternate molt. Now I will say I'm simplifying just a little bit tonight, and I've left out some, I'll say, more obscure molts that are employed by some passerines, but we won't deal with those because it's too complicated for bird bombs. And last point here, number 3, many birds wear this plumage out of the nest. So when that chipping sparrow fledges from its nest, it's wearing juvenile plumage. All right, so there we go. All right, so here's a quiz. And first question is, what species are we looking at here? So we haven't been talking about species ID tonight particularly, but it's kind of a fun question here. You notice right away, one is bigger than the other, but the bigger one appears to maybe be begging. And there's some things about it that give away some clues as to how old it might be. But what do you think that might be? In the smaller one, we see it has looks like a red crown, and then we see white supercilium and a black eye line, and is littler, streaked above. So if you got those down, then you know that that's a brown-headed cowbird, and that is on the left, and a chipping sparrow on the right. So now I've given it away that it's July. And so which plumages would these birds be in? If you look at the cowbird, we see it doesn't look like the adult cowbirds we see, male or female. It's streaked underneath. In this case, the tail looks kind of short, like it hasn't grown out. And we can see some pale at the base where the mandibles come together here at the gape there. And so that tells us that it is a juvenile. That's right. Of course, it's begging from this adult chipping sparrow, but given that it's July, what plumage would this adult chipping sparrow be in? So it's nesting. It's still in its nesting phase here. Still completing it. So it is still in. It is in its alternate plumage, right? That's the one the chipping sparrow nests in. It may even have begun its pre-alternate molt, but probably not. Next question is what's the next molt the larger bird will make? So we said it's in juvenile plumage. So what's next? It's going to begin in the coming weeks to molt, and it's going to have a pre-formative molt, right? Into the formative plumage it's going to wear for its first year of life. And what about the smaller bird? What's the next molt that it will make? So if it's in alternate plumage, it's going to go from that to basic. So pre-basic molt. Okay, just a little bit on this. So we've got a motley molting mallard crew here, and we can learn a lot of things from these. But suppose you were transported for a time to another planet, and you were then transported back to Earth, but you don't know what time of year it is. And you have this group of mallards, and they're going to serve as a bit of a calendar. So what month is it? We can at least go at that level, most likely. Can't say for certainty, but we can get within 1 month. So given the way these birds look, what month do you think it is? So we know the mallards go into an eclipse plumage during the summertime. So we know we're somewhere around the summer, you know, remember it stretches into fall a little bit. And we see that most of these birds don't have much color. And we see that most of them don't have much green on their head. And that one of them on the left, however, does have a lot of green, and it's got a fair amount of reddish coming in. And a couple of those over on the right have some reddish coming in on their chests as well. So we know this probably isn't at the heart of that eclipse time, which, if you remember, was July to August. Okay, so this is another time, and it's probably not before that eclipse time because so many of these mallards are in eclipse plumage. And then, so that's going to take us to afterwards. But since most of them are still in it and some are not, we're going to say this is coming out of eclipse plumage, and it's September. This happened to have been September 5th. And for all those reasons I was talking about, hey, some of these birds are not males. There's some females in there. The easiest way to pick them out is by their bill color. And if you do, you'll count 5 of them. Okay, it's a little challenge. So do you know the sequence? Can you fill in the blanks? Which plumages? I'll let you look at each one, think about which one belongs where. Probably the most important one to know would be number 5. But we want to know them all. And there we go. All right, so thanks everyone for watching tonight. We're going to go to some Q&A in just a moment, but I want to thank especially all the photographers who contributed images or whose images I used in the episode tonight. I'm very grateful for your work and for allowing bird bombs to happen in this way, using your great images to illustrate what we're learning about. So the images are credited on each slide, and you're welcome to become a Bird Bombs photo contributor. You can just contact me. It's very easy if you put photos on eBird. So you can check out tonight's Bird Bombs again at your own time, soak it in a little bit more, hop around here and there, pick up what you want, or go back to look at the other 17 episodes. We have an archive on the DFO page, a video, Bird Bombs video archive page that you'll find if you go to programs and events and just go below the current programs that are coming up, where you can register for the next Bird Bombs. But below that is a button that says Bird Bombs that'll take you to our archive. And the next Bird Bombs is coming up in August 17th. And our topic is going to be fall warblers. So Falling for Warblers is the title. And we're going to talk about identification of Colorado's fall warblers. So we're going to be right at the time when fall warbler migration is going to be kicking in. So it'll be perfect. So you want to check that out. So hope to see you then. I'm going to stop sharing now, and we'll go to our Q&A time here.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, if you do have questions for David, please drop them in the Q&A or the chat, whatever is easier for you, and I will find them. First off, David, we saw the male version from child to adult of plumage, but you didn't tell us what plumage you're in currently.
Well, plumage is
You don't have to answer that question, but I wanted to ask it.
I'm like in about umpteenth basic plumage. How about that? I can't count how many, but no, I'm definitely in definitive basic plumage.
Cool. I wanted to ask, thinking about so today I saw a lot of robins in their sort of juvenile plumage today, which was very timely. And thinking about, birds molting and, the adults that have just sort of, had their babies and they're kind of like getting everything going. And they're molting, and I saw a really rough Lincoln sparrow today. How fast do these feathers that are molting, how fast do the new feathers grow to replace them? Do you have any sense of that? I imagine they might vary, but
yeah, so the birds aren't necessarily trying to complete a molt as fast as possible.
Okay.
And that may not be energetically advantageous. Now, there could be certain species where, according to our life history, they do want to speed things up for some reason. Aside from that, we'll just kind of set aside that. And normally for something like a robin, to molt from a juvenile plumage, say, to a formative plumage is going to take a matter of maybe like 4 or 5 weeks, up to a couple months, maybe even a little bit longer. For that Lincoln sparrow that's looking a little bit rough right now, it's going to be similar. It's really like about a couple month period for the whole process, but they don't molt everything at one time. So molts proceed in a sequence. I didn't get into this whole aspect, but things molt, different feather tracks and things molt in a predictable fashion overall, as the bird makes its way through the course of its molt. Otherwise, we'd be seeing naked birds running all over the place, and they wouldn't be able to do anything. But so different feathers are going to molt at different times over the course of those several weeks it takes to complete the molt.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm curious to you talked a little bit about birds, getting quieter, or maybe more lethargic, more secretive during this time when they're molting, and we see that in like how we as birders detect them. Are there other things that they do differently? Do they eat different food to help with this process, or sing different songs, or maybe they sing less at this point because they're kind of done with the breeding season?
For a lot of the songbirds, they get pretty quiet, and that's part of why they're hard to detect. When we're birding, we do a lot of our detection by sound and song, especially during this time of year. And so if when they're molting, they want to be unobtrusive. They're not as quick as getting away, as quick at getting away, perhaps because maybe they don't have all their primaries or something. A little details about their plumage is making them less effective, less functional, and so they want to kind of hide. So that's a part of it, is they're finding places where they can kind of just lay low, and they will pick places where there's sufficient food to allow them to for their body to molt those feathers. So they may even move to spots that have better foraging, and that's part of that molt migration idea. One big example is in the southwest part of our country, say Arizona. They have the monsoon rains that happen in the summer, and there's a whole late summer, a whole burst of life there that provides a lot of food for birds. And birds will migrate some distance away from in their breeding range, say from just theoretically from Colorado to there, to molt there where resources are better and it's more efficient for them. So that's and with chipping sparrows, they're thought to move from the mountains, say, out to prairie areas in situations that happen to be more productive. And you can see that kind of thing even on a small scale, not molt migration, but just with dispersal, where birds will have been on their nesting territory that whole time. Think about those robins. Then they fledge their young and they move somewhere else. They move down the street, some distance away. They haven't migrated, but they've dispersed because resources might be better somewhere else. They've worked it, and so you see a lot of dispersal happening right now too.
Yeah, I've even seen that with like great horned owls when they have their babies and the babies fledge, all of a sudden they move down the street a ways. And
the last thing the adults want to do is be near those babies anymore. They got to get out of there. No.
Someone asks, kind of talking about mallards and ducks with the eclipse molt. They've been told that mallards aren't able to fly at all for a while. Do you know if there's any truth to that?
It is true, and that's the whole point of the pre-alternate molt that we call leads to the eclipse plumage. So there is there's no eclipse molt, but the pre-alternate molt leads to an alternate plumage, which we also call in the ducks the eclipse plumage, because that brightness is eclipsed by the female-like appearance. And so they have that molt first, and while it's still completing, the pre-basic molt is beginning. And while they're holding that eclipse plumage, they lose all their flight feathers. Not all in one instant, but to a point where they're not able to fly for a period of, say, a few weeks. And that's, you can see that you just won't see any mallards flying around there at a certain time during August. And some places you can go where ducks like to hang out in the summer. I'm thinking of Plum Creek mouth at Chatfield, maybe Cherry Creek mouth at Cherry Creek State Park, some of the big reservoirs and things. You might see big groups of hundreds of ducks, dabbling ducks, and they're all in eclipse plumage, and they're kind of just over summering in these spots where they can be kind of relatively undisturbed. Now they're going to regain their flight feathers back and be able to fly as we get into September. But there is a time when they are flightless. And that's the point of the female-like plumage, so they're less evident,
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, cool. Someone else asks that they say that they're seeing a lot of juvenile house finches right now, right? I've got them at my feeder at my apartment. They said there's often a stray loose feather here, like on its head, or maybe it's on its wing. They're always kind of like losing little downy feathers or something. Is this the preformative molt?
No. So those downy feathers are the ones that's left over from their very first plumage that after they hatch in the egg, they're naked and they develop the down. And then their very first molt takes them to the stripy plumage that we see when they're out of the nest being fed by the adult. And that's the one that's retaining little wisps of down here or there. They often little horns on the head is a common one. So that's the down. So it's at the tail end of its pre-juvenile molt.
Pre-juvenile,
a few bit of down. It won't begin that preformative molt for another several weeks, but it's coming up still while it's young. But when you see the wisps of down, that's a bird pretty fresh out of the nest, and that's the last little bits of the pre-juvenile molt still getting rid of that down.
Okay, right, that makes sense. So we have like the downy baby, we've got the pre-juvenile, the juvenile, pre-formative to formative, and then onwards. Okay, cool. There's a lot of timeline to keep in mind.
But the only complicated part is in the first part of the bird's life, because once it gets past the first, basically for a lot of birds after the first year, it's settled into a cycle that's repeated the same way, and then it either is in the same plumage all the time, or it has an alternate plumage with a pre-alternate molt. But the funky names and stuff are all in the beginning part of the bird's life, so it's helpful to think of that.
Okay, cool. Let's see, we've got a few more questions here. Gail asks, what is the molt timing in birds who complete long distance migrations? It's an interesting one. Instead of a bird that's around all year long, I imagine that a bird that needs to pick it up and head south pretty quickly might have a slightly different.
Yeah, usually two things are happening. Usually, one is that they basically, a lot of times it could run the gamut of things, but for many of them, they will either molt, maybe begin a molt on the breeding grounds and then suspend that molt during the time of migration and complete it on their wintering grounds. Or they may begin the molt on the breeding grounds and then molt some more where they stop over for a period of time on their way. And so we can see that, for example, with terns that may begin a molt on their breeding grounds, but then they may do a lot of the molting at a stopover point. Depends on the species. Like an Arctic tern, I don't actually know off the top of my head the details of their timing, but they're going, pole to pole, more or less.
Sure.
And I'm sure that somewhere in that cycle there must be some suspension of molt. But in a lot of those birds are also they may have what's called a protracted molt, where things may just take a long time to resolve. So for some of the species, that whole molting could be several months, up to 5 or 6 months, since that basic plumage is worn for half the year in a lot of cases. But it all varies from the different birds, and there you have to go and use some resources to research and find out how long things take. But often if there's a big migration, then it has some big impact on the timing of things for the molt.
Yeah, that makes sense. Kind of speaking of like diving deeper and reinforcing this, someone asks, is there anything that you recommend as sort of a learning exercise besides watching the recording of this video, which I'm sure will be up soon? How else can we sort of reinforce this info, like learn a little bit more and like kind of get these like timelines and these sort of sequences down in our heads and all that?
A little bit of it is just some basic learning, and there's not a whole lot to learn from like pre-juvenile molt leads to juvenile plumage, pre-formative molt leads to formative plumage, pre-basic molt leads to basic plumage, pre-alternate molt leads to alternate plumage. So that's a whole lot right there. You got a whole ton of information right there. A lot of words, but you also have captured a ton of knowledge actually, and just understanding that sequence. But what I would suggest, one great thing you might try this fall is to visit one of the banding stations. Bar Lake will have one. DFO will have a few field trips that our leader Charlie Chase has set up to visit the banding station, but they're also open to the public otherwise. And you can there you'll see birds in the hand. You can even talk to the bander about some questions about the plumage. You can observe close up some of these details. Those will be birds that are in some of these different plumages we're talking about, whether juvenile, formative, or undergoing pre-basic molt or what have you. So that's a great hands-on way. Another good thing to do is find some species that you see a lot of, that you can observe well. Could be robins, depends what it is, could be mallards, and go and watch them. And watch them with the eyes of what the heck plumage are they in, what's going on. It's really neat to look at the mallards at this time of year. Go along a creek, Bear Creek, the Platte, or whatever. There's going to be groups of mallards, and look at them and say, that's a male, and he's in this kind of phase of this movement from that pre-alternate molt into the cryptic female-like plumage, and out of that again into his pretty bright basic plumage. You can see it happening before your eyes. With some things are very easy to observe that way. So find things you can see and just put yourself to the task. That's a good way to get a little more into it.
Sounds awesome. All right, we've got just a couple more questions here. Mary Driscoll asks, the black-billed magpies seem to have left the neighborhood recently. She hasn't seen any in a few days. Have they gone somewhere to molt?
Yeah, so I don't know where Mary's neighborhood is, but the same thing happens in my neighborhood and pretty much everybody's neighborhood. If you pay attention, they're gonna fledge. They're young and they're noisy and everything, and then all of a sudden a lot of places they kind of disappear. And they may still be around a little bit, but you don't encounter too many. And then maybe you're going to start to see them in some large flocks of like 50 or 75 magpies, and that's going to maybe be in August sometime or September. So I see that happening, and what's happening, and I don't have all the answers, but they are going somewhere to molt, somewhere maybe in the local area probably, and they're becoming much less obtrusive during that time. As obnoxious as magpies are, that's all I can explain. So they're not going off to the great magpie land in Crowley County where no birders go, and there's really a million magpies there now, and we're not seeing them, but they're around, but they become less obtrusive because they are molting right now. So that's what's going on there.
Very cool. All right, let's see. Allison asks, I think in reference to mallards, we talked about mallards and pips. plumage and they can't fly. Do geese do this too? Like when they're on the roads, instead of flying away, they can't fly, and so they're just kind of in the way. Geese.
Geese
I
don't
think we
have
all
any.
know those
They don't
geese that are
have. They
just in
don't.
the way.
They do molt their flight feathers like mallards do, but they don't have any eclipse plumage, and they don't become more cryptic during that
Yeah.
time. So they have a different strategy there. But so yeah, a lot of times they're in the roads just because they know that people are going to slow down for them. And my strategy is you actually have to speed up, and because sorry.
And then they move. Yeah,
They do. They're not dumb.
they do. Yeah. All right, fair enough. Last question from Catherine. Catherine asks, do hummingbirds, which we've got a lot of right now, do they molt on their winter ground? What happens with hummingbirds? Do you know?
They're gonna molt. They're gonna molt soon. So
Okay.
the hummers have a molt. It's actually protracted. So some of that molt is going to be happening here before they go away from us, and
Okay.
then it's going to continue elsewhere. I don't know differences among different species. It's not uncommon for a set of birds, like say vireos, where some species do a certain thing. They maybe all molt on the winter grounds only, and others molt on the breeding grounds. So even within a group of birds, it can vary. And I'm not sure really off the top of my head for different hummers, but they will begin those molts here now, and you can see it where birds are going to be growing in iridescent feathers, immature males, for example, and then we also can see little pin feathers. If you look closely at birds at feeders or in your pictures, you can see little white marks. Say an easy place to look is around the head, and those are the brand new feathers that are opening up. So you can see it happening.